Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Erica Scharrer, a professor of communication at UMass Amherst.
wonderful, a lovely place, a great department, a great school. And Prof. Erica, I wonder if you would begin by sharing with us what's currently preoccupying, interesting, impeding, dynamizing you. What's happening for Prof. Erica?
Well, it was a big weekend for me last weekend. On the side, I have a project that started off as a lark and now has taken on a life of its own. I'm in a band, mostly a cover band. We cover indie rock from the 90s, Dinosaur Jr., Pixies, who else? Veruca Salt, if you remember that band. And we just played Food Truck Friday at a brewery last Friday to about 500 people. So I'm still kind of buzzing with post-show adrenaline and transitioning a bit from that experience over the weekend to, what's on my to-do list more
Right,
professionally this week.
being a prof. And what do you do in the band? I mean, I'm sure you all wear badges that say, I'm with the band. What,
Yes.
what does Prof E actually do?
I don't play a musical instrument, I sing.
Mhm.
So I'm the front woman. And, sometimes I pick up a piece of percussion, like the tambourine, for instance, or when we cover the song UMass by the Pixies, I play the cowbell.
Great. Now, some of the music you're playing presumably has been written with a male register more in
Yeah,
mind.
yeah.
Does that pose challenges or not really?
It does. In fact, your question reminds me of the low point during our 2 hour
Sorry.
performance. No, no, it's okay. There were highs, there were lows, there were, middle moments. That was the whole range. But
Right.
we had just learned to cover the song Lithium by Nirvana. And I just started off on the wrong key and started too low for my voice for sure. So during the chorus, I like it, I'm not gonna crack, that went fine. But the I'm so happy because today I found my friends, they're in my head, did not go well. So yes, sometimes this is something that we have to adjust for. We kind of sample across, all kinds of bands and all kinds of lead singers, and it can be a bit of a struggle.
But wow, 500 people. Is that the biggest audience you've performed in front of?
By far. And just to be clear, they weren't necessarily there to see my band. This event is a very popular event. It was one of the maybe last beautiful Friday nights of the summer in Western Massachusetts. The beer was flowing. There were 5 food trucks, and it was just a beautiful night to be outside and kind of forget the world for a bit.
Wow, fantastic. And remind us the band's name.
Yeah, the band is called The Kill Phil, which is an inside joke, and is not meant to be as aggressive as it sounds.
Not, we do not like Dr. Phil.
Right? It has nothing to
No,
do with Dr. Phil.
nothing to do with Dr. Phil, who, for those of you who don't know, I don't know if he still has his show, but he had a daytime pop
Oh yeah,
psychology show where he thundered against the left and against feminism and supported people with their psychological struggles. Was
indeed.
enormously popular and
Yeah.
monstrous in my opinion.
Oh, I'm right there with you.
But Kill Phil is, I guess, a bit like Kill Bill, Quentin Tarantino,
That's where the
troping
pun
that.
started.
Right.
That's
Got
exactly
it.
where the pun
Got
started.
it.
On Halloween, when the drummer, who is an English professor at UMass and a Chaucer scholar, was dressed as the Uma Thurma character
I
from
was going to ask
Kill
who
Bill.
plays Uma. So is that person a man or a woman?
It's a woman.
Woman. Does she use ribald Chaucerian rhetoric?
She does. She
Yeah.
does. Yes.
Heavens. Well, I hope the Republican Party isn't taking notes about what goes on in the band,
That's right.
or
That's right. That's right.
tenure
I
for you
hope so.
guys could be over.
That's right. That's so true.
On,
Yeah,
on
there are
that,
quite a few people right now whose speech in various forms is being policed for
yeah,
sure.
it is
So,
quite extraordinary, isn't it? And
yes.
again and again and again, in the name of free speech,
Yeah, irony.
irony, Orwellian irony. So,
Yes.
Prof. Erica, here's my confession, and this ages you. I I read your work first 25 years ago. Can you guess what I read?
Yes. I think you read the television book that I co-authored with my advisor from Syracuse, George Comstock, which was clunkily titled Television, What's On, Who's Watching, and What It Means. Am I right?
You are right. And I think it had a yellow and blue cover. Have I
It
got that?
did. It
Yeah.
did.
So it was a landmark text, an important book. And since then, your work has taken numerous directions, but that sort of question has always been important, not just with reference to television, but with reference to screens more generally. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that was a moment under the leadership of my former advisor, where we were thinking specifically about a medium, and that doesn't always drive my work. It's not usually medium specific, and that's, and so therefore I'm not always quite as kind of up to speed with all the nuances of platforms or, of media specific phenomena. But in that case, yeah, we did try to shine a light on television.
Television. And what got you interested in these topics to begin with? You said you worked with him in the doctoral program at Syracuse, which, for those who don't know, is a very famous journalism and communication school in a lovely, sunny, warm beach part. No, sorry.
That's right.
Whoops.
Uh,
In the
It wasn't
freezing
the
tundra
winters.
of the northeastern United
That's
States.
right. It was not the lure of the winters in Syracuse that led me there.
Oh, so where did you grow up? Can I ask that?
I grew up in upstate New York.
Okay,
So
so
actually,
thanks.
yeah, I grew up in upstate New York, which
Come
I like
on.
to call the Midwest of the Northeast.
Yes, yes. There are a few necks that trend red up there, let us say.
Yes,
But in
yes.
any event, what took you to that interest?
Yeah, so I think like a lot of grad students, I was shaped in a way by the professors around me for sure. But it's also true that I chose Syracuse mostly because of George Comstock, because at the time his specialties were, not necessarily specific to the medium of television, but he taught a class called Social Effects of Media or Social Impact of Media. And that was what kind of animated my interest,
Mhm.
is kind of, yeah, I think that was, he also had a specialty in young people in media. So one of the other books that he had worked on that we later co-authored a variation of was he originally had a book called Television and the American Child. And when we rewrote it together, we called it Media and the American Child. So his emphasis on children, his emphasis on what are not necessarily psychological effects, but social effects is what drew me to that program and kind of animated that work all those years ago.
Wow. And since then you've written a huge array of books and articles on so many topics. But I think this question of the effect of the media on people has remained important. I think the
Yes.
question of children has remained important.
Yes.
And connecting with those is the question of media education,
Yes.
right? So, and running through those things are issues to do with gender and race and class and so on. So, could you run through your current thoughts versus your earlier thoughts on media effects? Have they
Yes.
changed? Do you see things
Yes.
differently?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And yes, they've changed quite a lot. Um, and part of that is so, of course, kind of contextual for my own experience. So, way back in 1998, with a freshly minted PhD from Syracuse, I landed my job at UMass in a department world known for critical cultural studies.
Hmm.
And I answered a job ad that said, we're looking for a colleague who studies the social impact of media. So they were specifically looking for an effects scholar. And I got that job, I think, because I was an effects scholar. What I really didn't know until I spent time in my current department was that my own exposure to that point to the field of communication or media studies was pretty deep but very narrow. I was so kind of within effects from having studied at Syracuse that I almost didn't know what else existed, and how interests or concerns or commitments either kind of converged or diverged with the effects tradition. So that would take me years of just kind of, keeping my head above water at UMass and paying attention to what was going around me, with the work of my colleagues for sure, Sut Jolly, Justin Lewis before he left UMass, Lisa Henderson. The list goes on, but also my colleague Michael Morgan, who was the person who hired me. He was the department chair at the time and still, did some quantitative analyses of the role of media in individuals' lives, right? And so, I think I absolutely evolved from that moment. And in what direction? I would say in a reflexive direction. So I like to say that I think I'm a quantitative scholar when I choose to use that part of, research methods, because I'm in a primarily qualitative department. What I mean by that is that I think there's a certain accounting for what you're doing and why and how that you don't always get when everyone around you is doing the same thing. So I feel that if I had landed in a department where the majority of folks were doing quantitative studies of individual effects on things like, thoughts and attitudes and behaviors, then I would be a little less kind of self-critical, frankly, and reflexive about what particular methods and modes of inquiry can and cannot do. So that's one way that I've changed. And you'll notice you asked about effects, and I quickly went to methods, right? And so that's maybe partly what we can talk about is that the word effects, right, can signify so many things. But a lot of times it has kind of gone part and parcel with quantitative methodology, which is also something that I've kind of become, I think, a lot more reflexive about. Again, like what is possible and what's not possible, and what the limits are and what the strengths are. So that's one answer. What else? I actually think that in a way, effects, like calling myself an effects scholar is limiting, because I'm interested in much more than just media influence. I am very interested in content patterns. So, sometimes I want to study not individuals and their perceptions and feelings and experiences, but the um, I guess cultivation researchers would say like message structures on television or in other forms. I'm also really interested in people's opinions about media, not just whether media influences them. And then, like you say, I'm also very interested in media education. So, yeah, I would say since in the 26 years since I've been at UMass, I would say there were moments when I kind of retreated away from effects research, moments when I wanted to reclaim it as at least part of what I do. moments where I thought it needed some kind of repair, and generally, I think a more complicated view of effects these days compared to as such a fledgling scholar, back in the grad school days.
I mean, one of the things that students and parents want to know is if I watch this, will I do what I see?
Yes,
And on the negative side, in inverted commas, this is usually applied to pornography and violence. On the
yes,
positive side, it's usually applied to education.
yes.
And no amount of uses and gratifications or active audience theory deters parents, young people, journalists, etc., from talking about this. I
Right.
mean, every time there is a mass killing in the United States, the normally young person's media interests are scrutinized and they are put on one side of the ledger against Christianity, whiteness, masculinity, which are the good things in the person's life. There's some kind of audit that goes on all the time. And there is this question that won't go away that people ask, isn't there?
Yes. It's so true. And I find that motivating as a researcher.
Yeah.
I think I don't know what to attribute it to, but I hope this is a through line in my research is that I always want research to be of use. Like this is a hugely important commitment to me. Could be from my working class background and kind of a streak of pragmatism, that I think underlies a lot of what I do. But, I absolutely agree with what you said that people want to know about effects,
Mm.
right? And so we that should be part of the question, right? And I think one of the complexities, though, of parents and caregivers, journalists, policymakers wanting to know about effects is that effects are indeed complicated, right? So for every time I, meet a parent of a young child and I tell them what I do for a living and they say, what do you think about, should my child be watching this?
Yeah.
Or should my child not be doing this? Or my child does this amount of time of screen time. What do you think about that? It's effects research deals in generalities. It deals in aggregates. It deals in probability, right? It does not deal in I know your child. You know your child. I don't know your child, right? So I think, it's difficult to give a straight answer, I
Mm.
think, when people ask about effects, I think. And I think it should be difficult. This is actually one of the ways I hope we're moving the needle on effects research. One of my own critiques of effects research is that even though we're taught in quantitative social science that we shouldn't step beyond our findings, that we should be careful not to speculate beyond our findings. Sometimes there's like imprecision in how we talk about research, so that how we studied something becomes this kind of grand narrative about what is apparently going on in the world. So, again, like, I think this is like critique and reflection on methods that, for instance, if there's a study that finds that video game playing can contribute to aggression, that's situated in how video game playing was measured and how aggression was measured, and in the sample and in the moment of time in which that research was conducted. But yet, sometimes that becomes video game playing contributes to aggression, full stop.
Full stop. And of
And
course,
so,
sorry, go
no,
ahead.
go, please, please.
Often this research is conducted at a large university in the Midwest
Yes,
in a,
exactly.
inverted commas, the psychology 100 or communications 1000 class, where the
Exactly.
students are basically obliged to participate.
That's right.
This is not in, I mean, how this can be deemed to represent the earth is astonishing to me.
Same, same. And, and right. And so how can we go from these situated observations to something more grand? And we are usually trained as on the quantitative side of things to be careful in how we speculate or generalize, but yet I feel there's a lot of slippery, slippery kind of talk around research. Maybe that's true about any research, but
Well,
it's
here's the
definitely true
problem,
about
because
this.
just as quantoids can be disrespecting of qualtoids, so can qualtoids be disrespectful of
100%.
quantoids.
100%.
And all too rarely is there a dialogue. And one of the points you've made in your work is that actually progressive politics can make boyfriend and girlfriend with quantoid stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Could you talk a wee bit about that?
That's a dream and a hope and an aspiration, and I hope a movement.
Mm,
Other fields, I think, have progressed on that question. So, critical race theory, for instance, right, which is a multidisciplinary pursuit, there is a whole kind of subfield in critical race theory called quant crit or crit quant. Some people, say it one way and some people the other way. But in that area, for decades, people have been saying we can also harness the kind of power, right, of numbers, which is like the subtitle of my, my quantitative methods and social justice book, to toward the end of progressive politics, to work toward the goals of progressive politics, and that those two things don't necessarily have to be antithetical. Um, but when you try to do what I do, which is find connections and not and work across differences, um, you will always find critics, which is fair, but comes with the territory. So, like you say, sometimes there's suspicion that those things can never really be squared. And, rather than being defensive about that, I try to understand that and think it through and see whether one can start to reconcile, things like quantitative methods and progressive politics.
well, certainly, you've mentioned a couple of people who would appreciate that. Michael Morgan is
Yes,
assuredly one, but also Justin Lewis, who does lots of
yes,
quantoid stuff, as
yes,
his commitments. And I'm sure it
yes,
applies to others too. But on the one hand, what you've said very generously is that being in a qualtoid dominated department has enabled you to rethink some of your research. That apart from Michael, that may also have meant that it was a bit lonely at times.
yes, yes.
Right?
It was a bit lonely at times, for sure. And there were moments where I thought about leaving. And there are comforts in, being among people who are trained similarly as you. Um, I think what really kept me present at UMass is that the people who I mentioned, the senior people who hired me and who I admired and who provided a lot of the context, um, were very generous and said, we don't really differ by methods. We're interested in engaged research, right? We're interested in research that speaks to the world around us. And we are, really open for what that research might look like. But
Mm.
it's that overarching commitment. I call it to be of use, but also you could call it to engage meaningfully with communities and the public. That I think was a tie that really bound us all together and that I found a connection with. But yeah, on the flip side of the story, it could not only be isolating, but sometimes somewhat judgy. I had the unhappy job of teaching some grad students who just saw zero value at all in quantitative methods, the required class in quantitative methods. So that, caused some consternation at times. I do remember one year when a grad student said, "How can you call yourself a feminist and be a quantitative researcher?" So it wasn't always simpatico, I guess. There were definitely moments where it felt isolating, maybe even, marginalizing in a way.
Mm, mm,
But
mm.
again, that was never from my colleagues. And sometimes, I think that's part of grad school is that I think we learn to critique very strenuously, which is important and good. And sometimes, I want to remind grad students we have to be able to both tear down and build up, right? And, not just be expert at tearing down, but also be expert in building. And that I think gives a little bit more room for grace.
Now, in your attempt to define yourself as a feminist,
Yes.
and it's a pity this person hadn't read more of your work. You've done very valuable studies of gender issues and representation in the media, both in a content analytic and an audience studies frame. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that work.
Yeah. So my interest in that started in grad school. And I think there's one thing that I try to do always in my research, which is ask questions that are relatively unanswered. So I don't want to be the 812th person who studies, whether video game violence cause aggression. I'd rather ask what I think are equally, if not more, valuable questions that are less kind of in the mainstream of inquiry. So, with gender representation and gender and audience research, to me, that's always been questions of masculinities. Right. And so this started in grad school. My dissertation was a content study of masculine gender roles and norms and violence as seen in cop shows on US television, combined with a survey of people's beliefs in masculine gender roles and norms. And that was in the mid 1990s. And all these years later, I'm almost literally doing the same exact things, which is trying to unpack representations of masculinities and kind of the implications, how people make sense of those representations, and also how they shape norms, our views of what is normative, and I guess, kind of downstream questions of why all that matters. So yeah, masculinities in media, that's definitely been one of my areas of concern. And it's interesting to me. I think it's a particular moment now for the study of masculinities in media, given lots of current events and kind of changes in media technologies, including social media, right, and the manosphere. But I think all along and always, right, there's a lot to question and interrogate around masculinities in media.
And at one level, one might argue that the media act as carriers of masculinity may not have changed all that much.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
the means of making masculinist messages known may have shifted,
yeah,
but the core ethos of violence at the heart of masculinity, just as it's in Weberian terms, the core ethos at the heart of the state, maybe isn't all that different from 1,000 years ago.
yeah, yeah. I think that's probably true, which doesn't give us much hope for anything to change. Sadly, does it? Um, but yeah, no, it's true. I think that, that's partly the reason I'm still kind of beating that bush, right? Is that it is it's very hard to disentangle, right? And yet I think a lot is at stake, right? At the continuing intertwining of aggression and violence and
Hmm.
masculinities. There's a ton at stake, right? Clearly. Um, yeah. And,
No,
and the question of,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead. No, no, you go ahead. You go ahead.
I think that's absolutely right. And of course, we do have vibrant, feminist, queer, disability, and things like critical race theoretical denunciations of certain kinds of masculinity, and often this is very inflected by race and religion in the United States in particular, where you can see there are reactions against this, and you can see, think about Braywyn Connell's work, there are
Yes.
plenty of men and plenty of other people who are very opposed to
Yeah.
hegemonic masculinity. And so there are counters. But right now, uh, we're talking in the days after, one of the regular acts of political violence in the United States, but it's got
Yes.
more attention nationally and internationally than anything I can think of in terms of an assassination in years for very spurious reasons, tragic though it be. And that's the murder of Charlie Kirk. And I'm very struck by the fact that people like J.D. Vance and Donald J. Trump blame the media and Marxism, which they see as one,
Hmm.
for the murder of this person. And the left is likelier to say that the media are fanning a climate in which violence is acceptable on all sides. And right
Yes.
now, just as Trump is suing the New York Times for $15 billion because of its coverage of him, right? We're also seeing a very complex way in which journalists are trying to blame the so-called social media
Yeah.
for its effects. Now, that's not much of a question. It's more of a long paragraph, but I wondered what your comments might be.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of how sometimes the search for easy answers or the kind of clamoring for easy answers characterizes so many of these kind of moments right after a major tragedy like this. And, one connection I make to this most recent um, act is school shootings, right? It's like this happened at a university while Charlie Kirk was giving a talk. And, after shootings, mass shootings, school shootings, prominent violent acts, there does tend to be that one answer kind of approach, which is so, I think, problematic, right? And never going to actually illuminate anything. And then, yeah, of course, we put that across our highly polarized,
Mm.
moment, and the finger pointing just goes in all these different directions. Um, but yeah, and it was just so interesting to watch the narrative change as the details emerged, right? And the people on the right were very sure that this was somebody, the shooter was somebody on the left. And it turns out the narrative seems a lot more murky, right, than those easy knee-jerk partisan answers suggested. But yeah, one of the things I think is really important in the aftermath of this particular event is to also ask, why is this one getting so much play? Why is it so high on the news agenda compared to other acts of violence, right? Like the Minnesota senator who was killed is a very good counter example that got almost no news play. So yeah, this one I think just it is such it reflects so much that's going on at the culture at this particular time, right? Hugely huge amounts of animosity across partisan divides, concerns about speech, right, is definitely part of what's going on here. Is there free speech? Should any kind of speech be protected? What about hateful speech? Right. And then, of course, the gendered aspect of it all. Yeah, there's just so much to unpack.
And I wondered if I could raise something that you mentioned en passant earlier, Prof, when you said you're working class. Could you talk to us a little bit about class issues here? And also, is that something that you share with your students?
Yes, well, it's something for me that I don't necessarily claim. I'm not a first generation college student. My dad went to college. He became a high school English teacher. Um, but my family is from Erie, Pennsylvania, and worked in the factories, still work in the factories in Erie. And Yeah, and I would say I grew up kind of lower working class, and part of being an academic, which is a different story entirely, has been kind of an opening up of experience for me that I think is related to my own class position or income level. But yeah, I do share with students about my own class background. I think it's important to talk about kind of who we are and where we're from and how what we bring
Mm.
to, like, by means of our identities and experiences kind of shape our interests and our experiences and our ways of being. But
And
yeah, like I had never been on an airplane before I gave my first public talk, my first paper. That was my very first time to ever be on an airplane,
okay.
was in grad school. So I share that with students all the time. I also like to share stories of failure. I can tell a great story about getting my job at UMass and still being there 26 years later. Another part of that story is that I was the fourth choice for the position. The first three people came and did not get hired. So I guess they, weren't quite as impressed, and they went back to the applicant pool and invited me. It was like well into the academic year. I had already given up on it. So yeah, I like to kind of, talk about the personal alongside
Sure.
of
No,
the
I take that
professional.
point. And
Yeah.
another reason for asking about class is that it is a national obsession now in the United States in the way that it wasn't for a long time.
Yeah.
Race overcoded class. But now class in the United States means the good working class, which means the white working class.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is being claimed as a constituency over and over and over again. You can see the same thing happening in Western Europe and in
Yes.
Eastern and Central Europe. It's huge in Britain at the moment.
Yes.
Marches of people working for fascism in the between 110 and 150,000 this past weekend. Some of those people are people who don't believe in vaccines. Some of those
Yes.
people think that their brains have been taken over by artificial intelligence, and some are fascists. And
Yes.
then there are lots of others in between. But it's under the flag of a certain kind of white working class nationalism. Now, this is being used effectively by people who are nothing like working class in the United States and never were. And it's also being connected to legitimate political violence,
Yes.
it seems to me.
Yeah.
Here I am in Mexico, a long way away and yet not. Just the other day, Prof, I was listening to a podcast from Spain in English about Spanish football, not
Hmm.
the fancy boy football of the United
Yes.
States, but real,
Yes.
right?
Proper football.
Proper football. One of the commercials inserted for Mexican listeners in Spanish was a threat on the part of the Trump cabinet. In this case, Kristi Noem, I didn't know she could speak very good Spanish,
Mhm.
saying in very nice terms, we're coming for your families. Get them out of the United States. Because obviously,
Wow.
this is one of these podcasts where the ads are inserted based on where you are. Right? So
Wow.
this was for Mexicans. Quite shocking. I mean, spoken nicely, but with such loathing underneath it. And I
Wow.
wanted to ask you about this loathing, this adoption of working class politics, and the connection to violence and the use of the media. It's a big question, I know, but
Yeah. Yeah.
have at
Yeah.
it as best you may.
Yeah. Yeah. It's it is true that this feeling of kind of operating through fear, I think, of losing one's way of life, of not being able to thrive because one is working class, being on the wrong side of income inequality is what I would call it,
Yeah.
right? It is animating so much right now, and it's still shocking to me having witnessed it, like you say, not just in the US, but in other places, at how effective, in the US, I'll speak to, the Republican Party has been in harnessing that sentiment and suggesting that they are going to help, right? People who feel that either they feel threatened because they're worried about unemployment, they're worried about cost of living, right? They're worried about jobs, right? So many economic factors
Hmm.
are
Hmm.
driving sentiment. But now it's coupled too with this kind of almost nostalgic, hearkening back to a simpler time, right? Because I think it's connected to, well, an quote unquote anti-woke, right, mentality, right? And so somehow the idea of social progress has been connected inextricably with economics, right? And like you say, the poor white working class is feeling threatened, fearful, and left behind, right? And that is a hugely powerful force in electoral politics, in violent events,
Yeah.
in right. Yeah, it's still shocking to me because yeah, how is Donald Trump actually, right? And if you actually look at the statistics, but then you get to the other part of this trouble is that things have become so polarized that there's such distrust of numbers, right? And statistics, labor statistics, unemployment statistics, voting, right? Outcomes, right? If, if nothing is trustworthy anymore because everything can be written off as biased, what do we have left and how do we move forward?
Well, this is an interesting point because, on the one hand, the fact is that the constituency you're describing has been completely abandoned by the Democratic Party,
Yeah,
with certain important exceptions, like Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and
yes,
her allies, of course, and Senator Warren,
yes.
and most of all, Bernie.
Go Bernie.
Go, Bernie. We love you, buddy. And with him and Ocasio-Cortez and Spike Lee, my God, there's a triumvirate of
Yes,
actually addressing people's needs.
yes.
So I blame the Democratic Party in large for this. I think the Clinton era was absolutely disastrous. The
Abysmal. Yeah,
abandonment of laboring people really
yes,
starts then and just gets worse and worse and worse. So that's, I think, one element. But another element, it seems to me, is that there's something there about longing and yearning and legitimate aspiration
yes,
that is being engaged by these other people. But then there's a third thing, and this gets to your point about let's sack the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics because we don't like the unemployment numbers. Let's sack people at the Centers for Disease Control because we don't
yeah,
like scientific truth.
yes.
In a weird way, this relates to postmodern relativization of knowledge also,
Hmm.
as undertaken in universities by the left, mostly, apart from Borges, over decades,
Hmm.
and now
Hmm.
suddenly out of fashion. People like me believe in climate science. It's true, damn it. We believe in independent statistical information. about the
Yes.
economy. We believe in clinical trials. This is some sort of shift, isn't it? Isn't this the triumph
Yes.
of you guys in the Q
Yes.
versus Q debates?
Yes. Yes. And it does go back to quantitative methods, doesn't it? In a way, right?
Are you
Because
betcha?
it really does. And
Mm, mm.
it's a built-in tension that even though we can say all quantitative conclusions are contextual, that also doesn't mean they don't add up to something, right? They don't say something, right? And so it is I agree that there's a certain yeah, a certain contradiction, I guess, or at least a tension, right, about science, I think that is really important. When there's signs up in some neighborhoods, right, among the left or progressive types, in this house we believe, right? And it's like five different things. And,
Oh,
science is real is one thing that it
yeah.
says. We believe that science is real, right? And I keep thinking about critiques of positivism, right? It's yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting. I don't know whether you've ever looked at the mass observation diaries and studies in Britain in the 30s and 40s.
No, no.
So this was an attempt to get working class people using often random samples to select people to write about their daily thoughts.
Mhm.
It became very controversial, and Churchill had the mass observation officers raided when one of the questions people were asked was, when do you think D-Day will be? Because, there was the British and the Americans wanted to fool the Germans about not only when this would happen, but where it would happen. And they were very successful. But mass observation carried on. In some ways, it's kept going ever since. But these diaries were really interesting. So, and they're from the run into the war. What for people of my generation will always be the war.
Mhm.
Probably for your parents' generation, it will always be the war. Through to after the war, but as I say, with a big block put up against them by the ruling parties at the period of D-Day. And one of the things people are often asked is, what do you think of science?
Mhm. Mhm.
And science was a lot less common, much less prevalent, much less written about in those days, with many fewer applications that people were experiencing. I think it would be wonderful if you and your colleagues went back and looked at attitudes to science historically in the
Mhm.
States, but also elsewhere per mass observation, sometimes written with a hyphen, mass hyphen observation,
Okay.
sometimes not, and looked to see the extent to which, if you take out vaccines and you take out climate, what have been the key points, the peaks and the troughs of opinion, and then what
Yes.
happens when you add in climate science and clinical trials. Because
Yes.
one of the interesting things to me, so I'm talking too much, I'm sorry, but I'm just interested in this a lot.
Me
One of the
too.
key things for me is that the mistrust and the dislike of pharmaceutical companies and the sense that they bribe scholars is absolutely correct and justified.
Yes.
The trouble is that the very careful overlay of different clinical trials and authorities means that it actually doesn't matter in the end when it comes to the safety and the efficacy of drugs.
Yes.
So the core critique of Kennedy and others is right. Their decisions, their final analysis is completely and utterly wrong.
Yes.
But it's worth seeing where these tensions come from, where they ebb and flow over time, I think. Really, really
Yes.
important.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
anyway, I'm sorry, I've just been wagging
Yeah.
the male
No,
finger at
I,
you.
I agree. I think that would be fascinating. And I also think what we would probably find is if we could somehow overlay these questions about what do you think about science together with people's political ideologies, we would see that over time, political ideology starts to overwhelm or kind of explain people's views of science. Whereas I don't think that used to be the case. And I hope I'm not romanticizing. Maybe I am. But it is, I think to me, I think that question of what have people thought about science? Do they trust it? Do they find it credible? Do they find it valuable? Like you say, I think it might depend on, right, what aspect of science and and for whom, right? For whom and what aspect of science. And that is, of course, also related to whatever is happening in the world at the time. So that
Because
would be so cool to
back in the
see.
30s, it was just lowercase s science. Now,
Yes.
you might get people having very particular views about things like fertility treatments.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and, when it comes to their religious beliefs, whatever it might be. Prof, I have one more question for you, if I may.
Sure.
And then I'd like to give you the opportunity, should you wish, to add anything to what you've said. That might take the form of revisiting something we've already mentioned, or it might be new material.
Mhm.
It's up to you. Does that sound okay as a means of
Yes,
concluding?
sounds great.
Right. So
Sounds
my
great.
last question is, what are you working on now?
Yeah, thank you. Um, Lots of things. I'll explain a couple of things that are examples. So every year, a group of grad students and sometimes undergraduate students and I go to at least one local elementary school and talk to young people about a media related topic. And so this is my media literacy program that I've been working on almost the whole time I've been at UMass. So almost every year for 20 some years. The spring will find some contingent of the Department of Communication, including myself, at one or more local schools. And the last couple of years, the grad students have been very keenly interested in advertising in the social media age and what young people kind of think and know about that. And so we have data from sixth graders around their thoughts of social media influencers and their thoughts about the process of personalizing ads based on the data that they're leaving behind as they, like any other media user, use the internet. So we're working on that. We try to have like creative data collection means. So one thing I've been working on this summer is we asked sixth graders to draw the system that creates personalized online ads. So we wanted to know, do they mostly think in terms of users of their own presumed role, as people who use the internet? And who else do they think is involved? And what process do they think is involved? So they drew, maps of, one person drew a figure of a man and labeled it Zuckerberg and said he's in charge, he's involved. Other people drew a phone with a bunch of social media apps on it, and then drew a person playing soccer, football, and then drew that same person seeing ads related to football
Ah,
when they came back online. So, it's a pretty cool means of seeing what's in the heads of sixth graders, to ask them to draw something. And one of our goals is for them to learn about the system in more detail, like, what is an algorithm? We want to denaturalize algorithms. Like, guess what? There are people behind this, right? It's not magic. It's not automatic. Doesn't have to happen,
mm,
right? There are people who program, algorithms so that they can get data. There are people who broker that data, right? There are people who use that data to come up with an ad that they think you're going to like. So that's one example is media education data. And in my own kind of decisions to about how to approach a research project. It's really been my work with young people that has made me become kind of a self-taught qualitative researcher because I never had a single class on qualitative research methods in my own experience. But I've read enough and observed enough that working with young people in schools has really shown me the value of things like drawing or writing or recording our interactions, and just trying, or, talking, interviewing the young people, to really get beyond the limits of what they can provide on like a survey, for instance, and to get at some of the nuances of how they make sense of lots of media related topics. Then the last thing I'll mention is that I'm working on a new quantitative data set with adolescent girls, and this is with some colleagues at the University of Arizona. And we've been motivated by the phenomenon of Sephora kids, if you know that expression, right? Maybe a year or two ago, there were quite a few news stories about young girls going into cosmetic stores like Sephora, and using all the samples and creating a ruckus, but also putting like $50 down to buy anti-wrinkle cream for themselves. Right. And this, at least according to the journalist, skewed pretty young in terms of the kids that were doing this. There was quite a lot of scrutiny about, what's driving this skincare um, concern. And so we have some new data that we're analyzing this summer about adolescent girls' social media use and skincare behaviors, including like purchasing products, and engaging in quote unquote skincare routines, which I think are, partly fueled by the videos like Get Ready With Me on TikTok.
I have a 10-year-old daughter who only lives part of the time with me, but I quite like it if she spent more time on skincare and less time watching reruns of Modern Family.
It's true. I mean, one of the things that makes it such a good topic, I think, is that it's not, in a lot of ways, it's a wonderful thing, right? Young people, apparently are worried about things like sunscreen and the effects of the sun.
Right.
I
And
mean, I grew up in the 80s. I literally at home climbed out a window and laid on my roof of my house to get closer to the sun. So there are some very positive things for sure about taking care of one's skin.
this is the thing. She's mixed race, but fairly light-skinned, and
Yes,
I'm talking about sunblock. But this is not to make light of the very serious political, economic, cultural, feminist issues that are
yes,
more than
right.
implicit in your inquiry, and what a wonderful
Yes,
project.
thank
And
you.
I, I deeply admire both those things that you're up to at the moment. So, Prof S, anything you'd like to add or perhaps subtract from what you've said, from what we've been discussing during our conversation?
I guess I'll reflect again on methods. Sometimes I fear that um, I overstate the limits of a particular way of knowing, or that I think, it's a pretty fair critique of that sometimes when you try to do all things, it can be difficult to be good at any one of them, right? So, I do think that it's with some amount of caution that I critique quantitative methods, for instance. Like I still think quantitative methods have a part to play for sure. I still do quantitative studies myself. So I don't want to overstate, the critique. But I do think for all research inquiries, for all scholars, right? Having some being open to criticism, I think, is a starting place. So I guess that's something I would reflect on again.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. I have intermittently learnt from you for 25 years.
Oh, thank you. Same to you. It's honestly an honor. When you first asked me, I thought, gosh, I hope that Toby knows that, I've never taken a cultural studies class in my whole entire life, right? I'm completely self-taught, and that's got all of the, necessary, I don't know what's the word, caveats, right, to my understanding, for
Well, thank
sure.
you. I think you've contributed a lot over those decades and are doing so today. And literally today, I've learned a lot just from this conversation. So thank you so, so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.